sick from daycare today, so I'm trying to mitigate background noise by having headphones in. I'll just hold the mic close. It's great to be here with everybody again. Um, See a lot of familiar faces, hopefully some new faces as well. It's great to see the great diversity of places people are calling in from, multiple states, multiple countries. It's very exciting. What a what a blessing to be able to learn Torah across all these boundaries. So this week we're reading Parashat Shoftim. A lot of the juice of Sefer Dvarim, of Moshe at his last stand before he dies, sends the people over for the daunting challenge of setting up a society. Will they merit being able to keep a society? The stakes are very high. One of the main themes of Sefer Dvarim is that the stakes are very high of being allowed to run a body politic in the Holy Land, and that if you don't do it right, you don't deserve to have the land. So right in the heart of that charge from Moshe comes this week's parsha. So I'm going to jump right in. We're going to read the first 3 verses of the parsha, ask some questions, and then we'll. Is the sound still muffled? Sounds good. Okay, thanks, Susie. Um, um, and then we'll ask some questions and do some exploration. So here is a link to the document. I'm going to share my screen also, but in case you have 2 screens or you want to enlarge it or whatever you want to do, you have that. And I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, let's see if I can enlarge here. All right, so we begin the very beginning of our parsha. Does somebody want to come off mute and read these 3 verses in the English?
I'm happy to allow or ask people to unmute, but I will a Zoom hand will be most helpful if people are.
Anybody's excited to show off your most dramatic parsha reading voice? Yeah, Marjorie. Fantastic.
Here, Judges, right there.
Yep, right at the beginning. This is the very beginning of our parsha.
Okay, Judges, Shoftim, and officers, Shoterim, you shall appoint for your tribes in all your gates, which Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, gives you. And they shall judge the people with a just law. Do not pervert the law. Do not show any partiality, and do not take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the just. Justice, justice shall you pursue, in order that you may live and inherit the land which Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, your God, is giving you.
Marjorie, great intentional reading. I'm going to give everybody a minute just to reread quietly. Marjorie's dramatic reading helped us enable it to wash over us. Now let's read back. And I want you to read quietly. I think, what jumps up to you? Do you have any questions about this? If this was all you were told, what more do you need to know in order to implement these commandments? What's surprising or what's noteworthy? Are there any special points of emphasis or references? What jumps up at you? Give you a minute. Okay, yeah, we can open it up to questions and observations. I generally, when we do questions and discussions, I like to remove the screen share so we can see each other's faces. That might be the right choice here, but I think I'm going to leave the text up so that we can continue to notice things as people point out. And maybe I'll regret that later. I'll see. Jack, I see your hand. Why don't you go ahead? What jumps out at you?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I guess this is a really pedantic question, but like, what is justice and how do we define
Mhm.
that? Because obviously it probably has different meanings to us than it did then, and especially in a different language.
Great. And I think you're noticing in verse 20 the special emphasis, the doubling of the noun, which is a form for biblical emphasis, justice, justice. That emphasizes that it's important, probably, but it's not. How do we have confidence that we know what it means? And we see that's a word that at the end of verse 18, mishpat tzedek, a just law, end of verse 19, divrei tzadikim, the words of the just. In other contexts, it can mean righteous or it can mean vindicated or innocent. But I wanted to indicate in the translation that we have a word repetition. So that's good that you're jumping onto that and exercising some caution and humility. What do we know about that? Jack, before we take Ellen's question or comment, I want to ask you a follow-up question. Can you see any clues just in these three verses that might start you on the path of defining justice?
You may have muted and I need to find him again.
Jack Sierpatowski. Pardon me if I mispronounce that.
There we go.
Yes, that was my bad. I apologize. I
Yeah,
guess
do you notice anything?
the previous verse, like verse 19, maybe is giving
Mhm.
sort of guidelines, but I don't know if it's supposed to be specifically connected to the next one.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's good to exercise some exegetical humility, and there might be other cues elsewhere in the text, elsewhere in the book of Devarim, elsewhere in the book, like following verses, elsewhere in Devarim, elsewhere in Torah, that we want to look for. But I do want to encourage you, like if right there, if something adjacent is part of the same text, um, if 18 is kind of this overview and 19 has one set of specificities and 20 is another kind of generality, um, verse 19 might be especially important. So that doesn't mean it's the totality of how we define justice, but a good starting point might be thinking about um, partiality, false judgment, bribes, etc. So we're going to come back to that. But yeah, so maybe I think we're going to want to start our exploration or definition of justice with verse 19. Okay, Ellen, Giveret Lenore, and Rhonda in that order.
So I'm focusing on a few things here. The pursuit, as in right from the get-go. This is not something you will achieve in your lifetime or the multi-generations, but it needs to be a verb, like we are always pursuing justice. And I just have to say that, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I wrote in the chat, she like had this, I can't remember how she had it emblazoned on her wall, but it was part of her, how she saw her role in the Supreme Court, as a justice. And I'm also, there are some memes that go around and, they are memes, and this is kind of how I lived, distinguishing the difference between equality, justice, so many different things and what they really are in our modern context, acknowledging that we don't all start with that same place of empowerment within society. And I'm just kind of wondering how in the ancient times they might have looked at that, because it's like really different when the wealthy person shows up and the impoverished person who's gleaning in the fields, and we definitely have that today.
We certainly
How
have
do you not show
numerous,
that partiality?
right, numerous biblical verses that warn against, judges kowtowing to the powerful, being afraid of them or showing them favor. Also, one biblical verse warning judges not to just like automatically favor the poor either. 'Cause both of those biases can happen in judges, but certainly a lot more emphasis on like that is, it's not in this particular passage, but it's elsewhere. So yeah, thanks for that, Alan. Giveret Lenore, you're next.
Shalom, everyone.
Hello.
Those 19 and 20, I think when you look at it, do not pervert it. Because when we look at what's going on now with our courts, especially the higher courts, like the Supreme Court, these judges are appointed because of their tendency towards one thing that maybe politicians or certain section of society wants. Not the judges judging with impartiality. It's just, so I think when you look, well, what I'm looking at is once you do not pervert judgment based on your feelings or your cultural differences. When you think to judge, sometimes you might be in a matter, whether it's a family matter, and you might be leaning to an idea or one side. Check yourself, judge yourself first. When it says justice, judge yourself first as to why you're judging this way. Am I being impartial? Am I leaning because of my experience or my belief system? I must be impartial but fair. And even when you have judged, did I make the right judgment? Because they say you must pursue it. Because as a justice, if it is that you were ignorant of something of the law when you did it, or ignorant of something concerned, like you have a lot of people who have been sentenced whatever, whether it's jail or death, whatever, because the evidence wasn't clear, it wasn't there, and judges are now refusing to open up that case so those people can get fair judgment because of the political association. So justice you may pursue. And I think we can see this in our country that we live in now. Sorry, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Rhonda, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Actually, it's Kathy. I'm signing this Rhonda for another class.
Sorry, what's your name?
It's Kathy. But
Kathy,
good
okay.
morning. Yes, sorry, I'm signing to someone else. So I always think of this as asking judges to conduct themselves as if they're treating themselves. How are they treating themselves? Having humility, having those morals and those ethics to think about, I have another person's life in my hands. How am I going to handle this? It's not just about our personal feelings. It's also taking into account what occurred, how it went forward. And you have to just consider all those things. I think it's pure pay a vote right here. Advice, wisdom, ideas, ethics. So, to me, it's asking these judges to treat these people as they would treat themselves and to keep that in mind.
Thank you. Thank you. Where are you jumping off of something particular in the passage or shining light on it from other places in Torah?
Well,
I want to make sure we're following
saying 19, do not pervert the law, do not show any partiality. It's saying, how are you handling this? What kind of person are you ethically and morally when you're considering? I think that 19 really speaks to that.
Great. Thank you. I see there are another couple of hands, but I want us to see a couple other texts also. So with your permission, I'm going to pause on other comments. I want to point out a few other observations that I've made, and there will be time for more discussion. So Andrea, and I already lost who the other comment was. Don't forget what you want to say. We want to hear it. I want to point out a couple of things here. One, everything we talked about, all the comments, and really how I've thought about this passage for years also, focus on judges. And you could easily imagine if this passage was just written, judges you shall appoint for your tribes and all your gates, God gives you, and the rest of it was exactly the same as it is, we wouldn't notice. Everything would seem to make equal sense, and we'd have the same questions that we just had. I want to consider that though verse 19 especially directs us into the territory of judges, we talked about the Supreme Court, etc. The passage begins with judges and officers, Shoftim v'shotrim. Now, I want to be cautious and curious about how we understand both of those terms, but especially officers. It's not a term that we see a lot of use of throughout the Tanakh. I don't want to be anachronistic and just say, oh, this is talking about everything you know about cops today. Just think about cops. Or just because in modern Hebrew, this is the word that's used for police. I think that's anachronistic. There's a lot in the history of modern policing that is very different from pre-modern societies and biblical societies. There's a lot that we don't know about ancient Near Eastern and biblical law enforcement. Judging itself, I don't want to be anachronistic about assuming too much of a continuity. But with all those caveats in place, Professor Jeffrey Tigay and the NJPS and other scholarship and other classical parshanim indicate that the word shotrim is referring to some sort of law enforcement. It might be as different from contemporary police who are apprehending to bring somebody to the court. It might have been more people instituting punishment after they've been in court. So, somebody is arrested, apprehended, convicted of a crime and has to get lashes. The shoter might be the person who is administering the lashes. Shoter might refer to what the Mishnah is later going to call a shaliach beit din, a court messenger to go apprehend somebody, arrest somebody that would be more similar to contemporary police. So while it may not be exactly the same functions as contemporary police, I don't want us to be off the hook at learning important messages from this passage about law enforcement. In the same way, Ellen and Giveret Lenore both started thinking, I think quite rightly, about the American court system and what we can learn from this passage. One of the most distinctive things about America, one of the most American things about America is how many police we have and the breadth of the scope of what police do and how armed police are. That's really unusual around the world. And so to read this parsha as an American with all of our caution, that's something that we have to be curious about. How can we learn about what policing is supposed to be from this parsha? Now, and so then it's interesting to note that later on, after verse 18 starts, the latter two verses go back to this verb of shoftim. Shoftim are the judges. And it says at the end of that verb, v'shaftu ta'am mishpat tzedek, they shall judge the people with a just law. No wonder we forgot about the cops and we were just thinking about judges the whole time. It doesn't say v'shaftu v'shatru ta'am mishpat v'mishtar tzedek. They should judge and apprehend or whatever the people with a just law and apprehension or something, or punishment. It just says judge the whole time. So I want to suggest, number one, that we think about that and be curious about that. We're going to look at a Midrash that unpacks that in a minute. But one noticing might be that, just to name, that maybe the Torah is naming that all sorts of judgment happens in the effecting of criminal punishment. That we might pat ourselves on the back or soothe ourselves by thinking the judgment happens, the judge, the jury, whatever the system is, decides what the punishment is. They go off, whether it's a financial penalty, whether it's prison, whether it's lashes. That is just like a technicality that's very removed from us. But I think when we stop to think about it, letting the Torah reflect to us, we're well aware, I think, maybe I shouldn't speak for other people. I think the evidence shows that there's a whole lot of judgment that happens not only in like parole boards, but also in treatment and in carceral institutions, when penal bodies will, what financial penalties they'll collect and from whom, whether a poor person has been hit with a financial penalty versus a rich person's hit with a financial penalty, and what are the contexts in which they need to pay. There's a lot of judgment that happens there too. And maybe by making this equivalence, the Torah is drawing our attention that the same things that we are attuned to being concerned for in the criminal justice system, in the courts, which have this very theatrical and pageantry oriented public presentation about them, that same scrutiny should be applied to police. And in verse 19, just as judges can be subject to biases and to bribery and to perversion of their role if they get offended or something, the same might be true of police, and the less we pay attention, the higher the risk will be of that. So that's one thing that I just noticed here that I want to draw your attention to. The second thing is that, there's a lot of discussion to some extent in judges, but more with regard to police in our country, that, we've got to get that police reform means, better training or making sure the right people get in there. It's a few bad apples. So maybe let's get, at most, reform voices will be like, let's get the bad apples out of there. And some of I think our culture is attuned to thinking about the warnings of verse 19 with regard to judges. Of course, a judge can't take a bribe. And the judge might say, what difference does it make? I'm an honest person. So I'm taking an extra payment, but that's not going to affect how I make my judgment. And the Torah is saying, yes, it does. And notice that the verse 19 doesn't say, don't take a bribe, for bribes are the kinds of things that the foolish and the corrupt do. No, bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the just. A good judge, a learned, wise, and honest judge will become less so if they engage in these structures of partiality. And so following on the introduction of verse 18, we have to think about that with regard to police also. What are the structures of partiality and impartiality, that it doesn't matter how good the individuals are coming into the system, if we don't have structures of impartiality and fairness in police management, we're going to have the same kinds of corruption that we see in the judge system. And I think that's another equivalence that our passage is making. And the last thing I want to point out, just in verse 20, we get so rightfully mesmerized by the beginning of verse 20 with that striking passage, justice shall you pursue. Not just shall you do, which is the usual verb, aseh, of the book of Devarim, but pursue, which both indicates, as I think maybe Giveret Lenore, somebody said, that it might be a little out of reach, but we have to be always chasing after it. But also there's something more aggressive about that pursuit. Don't just wake up in the morning, do your job, fulfill it, but actively running after it to your dof, and the doubling of tzedek. But there's another thing about verse 20, which is that we have this remarkable expression that whatever justice is, and we asked at the beginning how, Jack asked, how do we know what justice is? And all these other questions about how we pursue it, what does it mean? The stakes are very high in order that you may live and inherit the land which Adonai your God is giving to you. If you get the criminal justice system wrong, you're not allowed to have a body politic. That's what verse 20 says. I just want to make sure we sit with that, because the stakes are very high. I think sometimes different forms of patriotism or just a kind of very human status quo life makes us think that having a body politic is a given. And throughout Sefer Devarim, one of the main emphases of the book is that having a body politic is not a given. And the thing that it most hinges on, where the Torah makes this conditional statement, is on setting up a proper criminal justice and penal system. And that leads us with a lot of questions. Well, those are very high stakes. How do we get it right? So I want to draw your attention to one Midrash on our passage from the work Dvarim Rabbah. It's a sort of late rabbinic collection of Midrashim going, passage by passage through the book of Dvarim, that asks the question that I opened with about after we took comments about Shoftim v'Shotrim, judges and officers. Why does it stick officers in here when everything in the rest of this passage seems to be talking about judging? So our Midrash offers the following. The rabbis say that officers should be like judges, shoter kishofet, in that they should carry out their deeds facing the rod and the whip. So the one issuing lashes should not be required to receive lashes. Ksheyu ha'ma'asim keneged ha'makel v'ha'ritzu'ah v'shelo yeheh ha'malkeh tzarich lilkot. I want to give a little bit of background here. The standard in the rabbinic understanding, the standard biblical crime, let's say eating pork, or lending with interest or something. The standard crime is punished by lashes. There are more severe crimes that are punished either by death or by karet, being cut off from the people, whatever that means. That's a big theological question. But the standard prohibition is punished by lashes. So when you think about the criminal penal system, your average person is being indicted and potentially convicted of a crime that, if convicted, would result in them having to be lashed. So officers, what is the way in which officers are like judges? That's really the question that our Midrash is asking. Why are both of those characters brought into this when most of it seems to be talking mainly about judges? So what is it about officers, police, that are similar to judges? In that they should carry out their deeds facing the rod and the whip, so that the one issuing lashes should not be required to receive lashes. So once again, our Midrash understands the shoter in our verse, the officer, as being the person who institutes state-sanctioned violence, a person who's been convicted of, eating pork willfully, and they're lashed with up to 39 lashes. And the person has to do that. And there's judgment involved in that. There's all sorts of halacha about how, the judge has to issue a ruling about an assessment of how many lashes up to 39 that the person can tolerate. And the person doing the whipping has to watch and make sure that it's not excessive and that they're using appropriate force. It's state-sanctioned violence, but the state sanction is not a carte blanche either. And the way, according to this Midrash, the way that Shotrim are like Shoftim is that both bodies, judges and police officers, have to carry out their deeds facing the rod and the whip. What I think that means is that there have to be structures in place that make them constantly aware that they will receive equal punishment if they act improperly. That improperly issuing lashes, using a little extra force because you don't like the attitude of this person, or because you're frustrated by other factors in your life, or because you don't like the race of this person, or whatever the case may be, you do that, that's a crime. This person is being lashed for eating pork, you would have to be lashed for issuing improper lashes. That is a biblical crime. And I think what the Midrash is aware of is that people in those positions of power, judges and officers, often think of themselves, and the structures allow them to think of themselves as beyond, prior to, or above the law. They're just administrators. They're not mitzvah practitioners at the time. And, it's just to bring this really down home. I mean, this came up very in the United States context, about 8 years ago or so, there was a lot of public discussion about police brutality. It hasn't really changed since then, but there was a moment of a lot of public discussion after like the Laquan McDonald murder in Chicago and other police killings in other places. And certain spokespersons of police forces, most notably, at least for me here in Chicago, was Rahm Emanuel, who was the mayor of Chicago at the time, made a very provocative statement saying that to the extent that there was, in Chicago, there was around the same time also like a spike in certain kinds of crime. Nationally, it declined, but spiked a little bit in Chicago, Baltimore, and Washington. 3 cities right on the borders of states that have no gun restrictions, for what it's worth. But in those 3 cities, there was like a little bit of a spike in gun violence. And Rahm Emanuel said, the problem is that police, in the face of heightened public scrutiny, are going fetal. That was his turn of phrase. In other words, I think the philosophy that Mayor Emanuel was articulating is that police, in order to do their policing properly, need to be free of scrutiny. It's scrutiny which interrupts their ability to police properly. And I just want to note, whether he's right or wrong, our Midrash says 180 degrees the exact opposite. Chazal, rightly or wrongly, said that police officers, in order to be able to do their work properly according to Torah law, can only do so if they're operating under heightened scrutiny, under facing the rod and the whip, under the awareness that they face severe punishment if they misstep. That is a real clash of philosophy of criminal justice, and I want us to take that very seriously. Personally, I tend to be influenced in my moral decision making more by Chazal than by Rahm Emanuel, but it's obviously, we should be cautious about deriving entire political protocols from a text edited around 900 CE without, jumping into anachronism. But I want to take that very seriously, that maybe a Jewish way of thinking about this is that when you're operating with the license to exercise state-sanctioned violence, you can only be expected to do so properly if you face very rigorous scrutiny, facing the rod and the whip, the awareness that any misstep could result in you facing the same violence, that you meted out. So that's one kind of rabbinic moment in considering the ethics of policing. And I want to turn our attention to another slightly more famous text that moves a little bit away from our parasha, but I think is very provocative. This is a story that appears, I'm bringing it here from the Talmud Yerushalmi, Tractate Chagiga, but it appears in several other collections as well. So Rabbi Yudin the Nasi, he's often referred to elsewhere as Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. It's the editor of the Mishnah. So, like the Babe Ruth of the Tanaim, like the person who was responsible for publishing the Mishnah, the major rabbinic force. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sent 3 of his trusted disciples, Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Asi, and Rabbi Ami, to travel the cities of the land of Israel so as to appoint teachers of Torah and Mishnah for them. He sets out on an educational campaign. They arrived in one place, it doesn't shame or name the city, but they arrived in one place and couldn't find any teachers of Torah or Mishnah. So these 3 rabbis, Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Asi, and Rabbi Ami, said to the city's residents, bring us the city's protectors and the city's guards, Nature Karta Vesanture Karta. The residents said back to them, so they presumably bring somebody, the text is very sparse, and says, okay, here they point, these are our city's protectors. The rabbis responded, these are nothing but the city's destroyers. And then the residents say, okay, smart guys, so who are the city's protectors and guards? They responded, teachers of Torah and Mishnah. That's the meaning of that which is written. Unless God watches over the city, the watchman keeps watch in vain. I want to offer 3 readings of what this text might mean. So first of all, what seems to happen, we have to fill in the blanks a little bit. It's an oral text that has been committed to writing and very sparse writing. So you have to do some filling in. Seems like what happens if you're going to stage this is that, you know, the rabbis arrive in some city and get to, like, I don't know, the city council or the public, they get to some public space and they're like, who are the city's protectors and guards? And the residents go and point them out or bring them, probably, we don't have proof of this, but presumably pointing to like the cops or the, you know, whatever the, I mean, they said protectors and guards. So they probably point to like security guards and cops or something. And they say, these are our city's protectors. You wanted to meet the cops? Here they are. And the rabbis are like, no, those aren't the protectors. Those are the destroyers. And you can sense the feeling of like the residents being like, all right, dude, I don't even know you. You asked me for the guards, so I brought you the guards. What you're trying to make some pedantic point. Like what? All right, so what are you looking for? And they respond to teachers of Torah and Mishnah. So 3 potential readings. The reading of this passage that has gotten the most fuel in the 20th century and early 21st century is a reading that says that any kind of, you know, engagement with civic political life actually destroys Jewish society, and the only thing that keeps Jewish society safe is studying Torah. You'll notice that the term for the city's protectors, Neturei Karta, is the name that was taken by one of the most extreme Haredi sect, a small sect that is well known for, among other things, for like always protesting the state of Israel and like being very anti-Zionist. But their anti-Zionism is really grounded in anti-Jews engaging in the body politic. So there's something a little weird when like more secular anti-Zionists like glom on to the Neturei Karta. The Neturei Karta are really saying like a radical expression that like only Torah keeps us safe. Less extreme versions of it are found, you know, within Israeli society with army exemptions for yeshiva students being like a broad program, etc. We have no business getting involved in the political life, only Torah. I think it's a possible read of the text, but I think that reading ignores a few of the like literary details. And I want to offer 2 other readings of this text. Another reading that's, I think, also radical in a different direction is to say, is to like a kind of a police abolitionist reading. To say, police do not keep us safe. If you ask people to go look at their life and what keeps them safe, relationships keep us safe, institutions of culture keep us safe, well-lit streets and having sufficient resources that we don't have to fight over them keeps us safe. Those are the things people usually talk about. And a lot of violence actually originates with people who institute violence and are armed walking around cities. And this text might be an articulator of kind of a police abolitionist, not a politics abolitionist, but police abolitionist view. And as much as I'm sort of sympathetic to that, I think that a slightly more cautious and literarily sensitive read is take seriously the context that the rabbis engage in this somewhat ridiculous rhetorical game with the residents in a city where they couldn't find any teachers of Torah or Mishnah. It could be that if they arrived in a city that had like a really thriving cultural landscape and a great education system, and there was also an appropriate, maybe small, security apparatus that was in place, it could be that the rabbis wouldn't have bothered with that at all. Maybe what's happening is they arrived to a place that's teeming with cops, but is gutted of schools and cultural institutions. Let's say, like, again, I live in Chicago and I have a kind of bias in how I read things, like the South and West sides of Chicago. That same Mayor Emanuel I mentioned, like, shut down 50 schools in all like poor neighborhoods, black and brown neighborhoods, and then took the same money that he saved on that and poured it into having more police officers in, patrolling their neighborhoods. Maybe these rabbis are arriving in a place that's teeming with cops, but you can't find a school anywhere. And in that case, they're engaging in this kind of rhetorical gamesmanship with the residents, being like, all the cops in the world are not going to keep you safe. The foundation of what keeps you safe is meaning making, cultural meaning making, constructive and creative institutions such as schools, places of learning. For us, that's Torah and Mishnah. That could be other things for in other cultures. On top of that, yeah, sometimes fights might break off and you might need somebody who knows how to de-escalate and intervene. But in this context, don't think that like the answer to all your problems is just throw more cops. If maybe this text is telling us that if your response to any kind of fear is throw more cops at it, that is a failure of imagination that is now documented at this city and that the Talmud Yerushalmi is recognizing, but it's a failure of imagination that Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yassi, and Rabbi Ami want to really intervene at. That our first reaction to fear should be, well, what are the structures of culture and meaning making and relationship giving, of horizontal connection and of vertical meaning making. Even in the book of Eicha, you might recall, looking at the destruction, you see all these verses too about like nobody's listening to elders anymore. There's no schools, Ein Torah. I think that's the sense that all the soldiers in the world were only part of the problem, and they're certainly not the solution if we don't have these institutions of real safety generation. And bring it back to our parsha, when our parsha is not abolitionist. It explicitly commands us to set up these systems of a penal system and a criminal justice system, but gives us this context of how Jewishly do we think about how they're supposed to operate. They're supposed to operate with a serious sense of limitation. And I think from our verses, it's a sense of like limitation of their license. And this story in the Yerushalmi that like looked at kind of an applied policing gives us a sense of the limitation of their scope and of their quantity. We cannot pack all of our sense of justice and safety and security into more guns and more cops. We have to start with what are the structures of infrastructure, of learning, of meaning making. If we have really, really, really great schools and cultural institutions and theater programs and music programs and art programs in every place, especially where people otherwise lack resources, then maybe a lot of the criminal justice will take care of itself. And I'll end with that and wish you a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, and thank you all for sitting in some discomfort. And I both saw the discomfort in the chat and also would really like to thank everyone for like the polite and constructive comments in the chat. Rabbi, I hope it's okay to take one more minute. I've been putting our Torah leaders on the spot, and before we close out, can you give the folks here like a bracha for Shabbat or an intention or something that they should go into their weekend with?
Sure. I'm on the spot. I offer you that everybody should enter Shabbat with a sense of inner calm and external solidarity and connection, that it should be a Shabbat of inspiration and rejuvenation and profound rest, and a Shabbat of recentering and remembering that Shabbat is not here to give us energy for the other 6 days. The 6 days are to practice the skills to arrive at Shabbat and to envision the world as it should be, a world without instrumentalization of other people. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.